I found out
Look at that.
later on just how devastating
Children
this
decided
was.
it was time for mother and father.
As many of you know, 2017 and 2018, the current year and last year, are the 200th anniversaries of, the 100th anniversary of both Maine and the United States participation in World War I. World War I was declared, as far as America's participation was concerned, on April 6, 1917, and we're just coming up on the 100th anniversary of the armistice, November 11th, 2018. So in that period of 19 months, there was a tremendous amount of activity, both militarily and on the home front here in Maine, relating to the war effort. By way of a little background, of course, and we'll get into this with the first slide in a moment, bearing in mind that the war had been going on since the summer of 1914, and it took quite a while for America to make a decision to actually enter the war. The war had broken out in the summer of 1918, and basically the protagonists were the Allies, whom America favored, were the French and the English, Belgium, and actually the Russians were allies at one point. And then, of course, the Germans were on the other side, so to speak. So here we have our first picture, which is of Monument Square in Portland, about 1916, a year before America enters the war. And here we have the British-Canadian recruiting station. And you'll recognize right behind it is the great Civil War monument that's still there in Monument Square. And the story here is, why British-American recruiting? Well, technically, of course, no American citizen was supposed to be joining a foreign army, but because the United States was partial to the Allies, we looked the other way when it came to our people joining up in both the Canadian and British armies, and also the French, to that matter, if that were an opportunity. So there actually was active recruiting for both the Canadian and British forces here in America, and this is a good example of it. And then too, Maine being a border state, there were some British and Canadian citizens living and working in Maine, and so they were appealing to them as well. When the war began in April of 1917, our president was Woodrow Wilson. Wilson had come to national prominence, first as the president of Princeton University, then as the governor of New Jersey, and then he won in a famous three-way race where William Howard Taft wanted to be reelected as the Republican president. Teddy Roosevelt wanted a third term and had his own party, the Bull Moose Party. And because of the three-way race, the split in the Republican Party, Wilson got in. And Wilson was then reelected in 1916 on a platform of "he kept us out of war." But I think Wilson knew, just as Franklin Roosevelt knew in 1940 when he was running for re-election, that it was only a matter of time before America would be drawn into the war. When the war broke out, there were a number of standing units here in Maine already as part of the Maine Army National Guard. They were located all around the state, and the Maine Army National Guard began a recruiting effort using these homemade posters. You've got it to do, why not start now? A measure of Maine's patriotism. These are very rare posters. There were just a few made because very quickly the National Guard got federalized, got incorporated into the larger federal army, and very quickly the federal government took over the recruiting process, both for the Army, the Navy, the Marines, and for the Infant Army Air Force. This is a naval recruiting poster, and the federal government was very savvy at promoting the war effort. Woodrow Wilson actually hired the top PR man in the country to run the effort for him, and very quickly some of the top artists in the country. Howard Chandler Christie did this poster of the young woman in the naval uniform, but also famous artists like N.C. Wyeth and Howard Pyle and James Montgomery Flagg were all brought into the war effort. The interesting thing about this poster is, though, that it was customized to be used in Maine. You can see the last line says, "Go to 207 Federal Building in Augusta." And of course, gee, I wish I were a man, I'd join the Navy. Well, of course, 100 years later, you can be a woman and join the Navy. So. Quickly, national personalities were recruited to promote various aspects of the war effort, and President Wilson very graciously contacted former President Taft. I think you can pick out who he is in the automobile on the left there. And he was asked appropriately to tour the country to talk to the farmers, to encourage them to raise more crops for the war effort. And so here we find him on May 17th in Market Square in Holton, in an open car being driven around Holton. He gave 2 talks to farmers in Aroostook that day, and really quite a trek to take the train all the way up into Aroostook for those brief talks, and then go elsewhere around the country. Quickly, makeshift recruiting stations were established in communities. This is one in Portland that was sponsored by the Portland Evening Express for both the Army and the Navy. But Portland being a maritime port, you can see that the preponderance is young naval recruits. Here's another recruiting photograph, an interesting one, in which we have Governor Neptune of the Passamaquoddy tribe at the left with an old rifle from the 19th century, and then he's standing next to the old recruiting sergeant. This is probably somewhere in eastern Maine. Of course, the Passamaquoddies are based at Pleasant Point in Eastport. There is a sad footnote to this photograph of Governor Neptune in that there were about 20 young Passamaquoddy men who volunteered for World War I, and they all went over and served in France. And the day before the war was over, Governor Neptune's son was killed. So all over Maine, in those first months of the war, April, May, June, into the summer, the scene was the mobilization of these Army National Guard units. Here is a group of National Guardsmen marching to the railroad station, marching down Main Street in Farmington. And here's a massive gathering of troops and their family and friends get ready for the train to come into Dexter, where the Army National Guard unit from the Dexter area was assembled. And these units would then be shipped out on trains to go to training camps. Most of our Maine men trained in camps like Fort Devens near Boston, but some of them went up into upstate New York to Camp Drum near Plattsburgh. Here's another scene, mobilization scene, September 1917 in Belfast, where the boys are already on the train and their friends and family are saying goodbye to them. Most of the troop trains had to go through Union Station, the great old station that some of us remember on St. John Street in Portland. And here is one view of the Boston and Maine car stopping with recruits and being given sandwiches, cigarettes, candy, newspapers, magazines by uniformed Red Cross workers. And here's another view of that happening at the train platform in Union Station. The Red Cross was one of the great forces, both on the home front and at the battlefront in France, for supporting the troops. And we'll get into this a little bit later, but thousands of Maine women joined the Red Cross during this period. Here we have a group of young men from central Maine who are training at Camp Drum in Plattsburgh, and they are part of the Signal Corps. This is most of the images that I'm showing you today are from what are called real photo postcards. When postcards first became popular in the early 1900s, many of them were color lithograph postcards made in Germany. But as soon as the war broke out in 1914, of course, the German postcards were largely no longer available. And so what happened was local photographers started making actual photographic postcards. And thank goodness they did, because this is, to a large degree, how we have a record of the home front in Maine. This one was taken at the training camp, and it's interesting because on the back it's written to Mrs. Bourke in Waterville, and it's written in French, so it's a Franco-American family, and it's signed by her son George Bourke. I didn't know until this January, when I did a January seminar program at Colby on World War I, that he was a Colby graduate who left the school to enlist for the war and was later killed in France. And here is this precious little postcard that somehow survived of his, he's in the group training in New York to go overseas, and sent to his mother and written in French. Everywhere there were patriotic parades in those early months of the war. Here are the troops assembling to leave from the Lewiston area. This is Lisbon Street in downtown Lewiston. Here's a big parade on the eve of the war on Congress Street in Portland. There was what was called a preparedness movement. There was a whole segment of the population that believed that our involvement in the war was inevitable. And so this is a parade actually just a few days before the war. And to give you your bearings, center left, the largest building is the old Porteous, Mitchell and Braun department store, now the Maine College of Art. Now another parade here in Monument Square, once the war is underway. This is a group of Maine National Guardsmen who were called the Milliken Regiment. And that was the name of the governor of Maine at the time, Carl E. Milliken, who was elected in 1916 and served from 1917 to 21 all through the war. We'll see him at the end of the program, but early in the war he decided that he would adopt a kind of costume or uniform. So everywhere he went, and he was everywhere during the war, he wore a tall silk hat and a long tail coat, a formal attire, so that you had no question about who the governor was. One of the big efforts to involve the populace by the government was raising money for the war effort by selling war bonds and war saving stamps. And there were parades devoted just to getting people excited about contributions. This is such a parade on Cumberland Avenue during the war period with a tank. And of course, the tank, the airplane, the terrible gas, these were all new features of modern warfare that were introduced for the first time in World War I. The bond effort was a tremendous success. In Maine alone, over $100 million in bonds were bought in a 19-month period. Enough so that it was calculated on an average that every man, woman, and child in Maine gave $147 toward the bond effort. Yeah, even by today's standard. So the parades continued. This is May 8th, 1917 on Water Street in Augusta, a huge parade for the towns of Kennebec County. And you see them, men carrying the huge flag down Main Street in Augusta. Just to give you an idea of the participation, there were about 10,000 people who came to this parade. Where I live in Hollowell, there were 2,000 people in 1917. There are about 2,000 people in Hollowell now. Hasn't changed much. But of that 2,000 people who lived in Hollowell, it was calculated that 800 people from Hollowell attended the parade that day. There's another view of this huge crowd in Augusta, the Patriotic Parade of May 1917. There were other huge parades, military parades, such as this one up State Street in Bangor in the spring of 1917. And here is the University of Maine Regiment. Of course, the University of Maine was a land-grant college founded in 1865, and one of the provisions of the land-grant colleges was military training, much like what we would have as ROTC today. So when the war came, there was already a university regiment in place, and they're shown marching in Bangor. And another big march in Bangor, June 29th, the Red Cross Parade, June 29th, 1918. It's estimated that in the Bangor Brewer area alone, that 1,200 women joined the Red Cross during the World War I period. Now, for the most part, it was symbolic in that they didn't ordinarily wear these white uniforms, but they got together and did many fundraising efforts for money that was then sent to the troops in the training camps and the troops in France. And they rolled bandages, and they brought together care packages to send to the front and to the French hospitals as well. The Red Cross did a great deal.
The line goes.
Oh yes, well,
back.
1,200 ladies. And there were parades everywhere, even out on the outer islands. This is raising the honor flag parade in April of 1917 on Vinyl Haven with some young naval recruits at the left. And we believe that these young Navy men were from the naval station in Rockland. There were naval stations at Kittery, the Portland Harbor, Booth Bay, Rockland, and in the Mount Desert area during the war. I mentioned already the war savings stamp and bond effort. The Canadian British recruiting station was replaced when the war began in front of the statue in Monument Square with a good Maine log cabin. And so for the 19 months of the war, this was the headquarters in the Portland area for people being encouraged to go in and buy their war savings bonds and their savings stamps. My father was born in 1899, not in Portland, Maine, but in Portland, Connecticut. And I was going through his papers recently and found that as a young construction worker in Hartford, Connecticut, in 1917, at the age of 18, he bought a $50 war bond, so, which was a lot of money in those days. Another technique used for raising money for the war savings stamps and bonds was to actually go out into the smaller communities and do these kind of little performances. This is a Browning machine gun on the back of a little sort of army truck that went up and down Route 1 to the communities along Route 1 to raise money for the bond effort. And they're stopped on Main Street in Searsport. And then there were these big rallies, sometimes a combination of bonds and Red Cross. This is a large gathering on the Main Street of Skowhegan in 1917. A very dense crowd. And then everywhere, in offices, in churches, in factories, people were implored to support the effort through the purchase of stamps and bonds. This is the Marine Hardware Equipment Company, which made fittings for the ships that were being built for the war effort in South Portland. And this is a group quite late in the war, October 1918, assembled in front of this little factory, proudly showing a banner indicating that every employee had bought a war bond in this factory. And of course, children were brought into the effort. In that Red Cross parade of June 29th, 1918 in Bangor, where we saw the endless stream of ladies, there also was a group of girls in white dresses simulating Red Cross uniforms.
You can see that line goes way.
Oh yeah. And then in a similar parade in April of 1918, the boys were not left out. The interesting thing is, in the early years of the Boy Scouts, because the Boy Scouts were formed just before the war, the uniforms were basically modeled on the military uniforms, the Army uniforms of the period, so they're almost interchangeable. But you see there's one little fellow here who's representing the Navy in the front. Now, in terms of this particular parade, the boys have little sort of mock wooden guns that they have slung over their shoulder. But in another Bangor parade, the newspaper said that the boys were carrying shovels and hoes, and that was to remind their parents to participate in the Victory Garden effort. And some of us remember our parents talking about, or maybe even remember ourselves, about the Victory Gardens in World War II, to raise your own vegetables in order to have more food for the troops. And so many of the outreach programs that were effective in World War II were first tried out in World War I. That was the blueprint. Here's a group of Boy Scouts in Lincoln, Maine, in northern Maine, in their uniforms that are virtually identical to the Army uniforms of the period. The Boy Scouts were very active. They helped with bond drives. They gathered books that were sent to the troops. There's a wonderful photograph, I don't have it here, of a Boy Scout troop with piles of books in Andover, Maine, that are going to be sent to the troops in France. And of course, the war effort went right into the schools. This is a patriotic pageant in a school in Gardner, Maine, with a young Uncle Sam at the center, flanked by two young Army guys. We have lots of young Red Cross girls and a smattering of Navy men as well. Now, some of the symbols that we even use today relating to the military were developed in World War I. One of them was the service star. The blue star indicated how many men a particular organization had in service. And of course, the gold star meant the loss of one or more men from either your family or your organization. This is a postcard that was sent out by the First Baptist Church in Portland to its members, proudly heralding that 65 members of the Baptist Church were on active service in World War I with the blue star. Businesses adopted the blue star system as well. This is the old Loring, Shorten, Harmon, which was the long-time stationery and bookstore in Portland, also toys as well, as I remember. They're sending out a postcard to their customers saying, labor is scarce, our men are being called to serve the country, we cannot replace those who have gone, we're just doing the best, so please understand that we maybe not give you the best service as we have in the past. And then there's a group of stars at the top of the postcard that indicates how many of their employees have entered the military. Now, probably yes, right, of all of the ephemera, of all of the things produced for the war effort in Maine, homegrown, so to speak, this has to take the cake. In April of 1918, Governor Milliken declared Maine Potato Week, in which people were encouraged to eat potatoes and save the wheat for the troops. And this is a poster that the state of Maine put out to promote Maine Potato Week. There are only a handful of these that have survived. Maine Historical has one, the State Museum has one, the Bangor Public Library has one. But to me, you know, it's one of the great posters of World War I. And of course, this whole conscious raising about raising and conserving food. Here we have a July 4th parade in Monmouth with a poor old steer that's been hitched to a piece of farm equipment for creating a float that says, "Raise more beef." The artists here in Maine got involved, as well as the national artists. There was a very well-known artist in the early 20th century named Mildred G. Burridge. She lived in Kennebunkport, and she did a number of drafts, a number of designs for World War I posters. They weren't actually picked up by the government and printed, but the original paintings for them survive. This is one where she has the Maine pine tree atop the world with the flags of the Allies, and then on top of it is the Red Cross flag. It's really quite a beautiful composition. Any takers on who this lady might be? Any guesses? She's in the Red Cross. Margaret Shea Smith. Margaret Shea Smith was born in the late 1890s, and so by the time of World War I, she was old enough to volunteer for the Red Cross. We think of Margaret Shea Smith's enter into public life after the death of her husband, Clyde Smith, in 1940, and then running to take his place and then becoming senator. But here we find in 1917 in Skowhegan, where she was growing up, she's already volunteering for a public service. This is a fascinating photograph. It's taken in 1915, the summer of 1915, in the summer community of Seal Harbor. And what we have here on the right is Edward Dunham, who is a physician and also a colonel in the Army. And he has mobilized both the summer ladies and the local ladies to get together at the same table, so to speak, and roll bandages, you can see the box in the foreground, that are then going to be sent to French hospitals. And this was one of several efforts in that summer to aid the French hospitals. Here is a lady who worked in the Dunham cottage, the Dunham Summer Cottage, and she's getting yarn ready for knitting, and you can already see on the table there are pairs of socks. During the summer of 1915, the summer ladies and the local ladies of Seal Harbor knitted 500 pairs of wool socks to be sent to French hospitals. And here is Mrs. Dunham and her daughter getting together care packages to be sent to the French hospitals. And not long after this, the daughter volunteered to go over and work in the ambulance corps in France. Quite a few men and women from America, before America got involved in the war, went over and served in various capacities in France. The ambulance corps was particularly popular. Waldo Pierce, famous Maine artist from Bangor, was in the ambulance corps, and he had a friend who became a lifelong friend who worked with him in the ambulance corps in France, Ernest Hemingway. Now, the fact that so many men, there were somewhere between 30 and 35,000 men who either volunteered or were drafted into the military from Maine during World War I. So it opened up in the factories opportunities for women. Now, women had been working in Maine factories ever since the 1840s and 50s, since the beginning of the textile industry and then the shoe industry. But there was a greater need for them than ever during the brief period of the war. This looks like a Red Cross parade. It's in South Berwick, but actually these ladies are in Red Cross style costumes, but their banner says Cummings, and they're in a patriotic parade representing their factory where they work, the Cummings Shoe Factory. Many Maine factories, whether it was shoes or textiles or clothing or whatever, made large amounts of material that were sent to the war effort. Probably the most hazardous of war work was the assembling of artillery shells. And this was actually left to women because their hands in most cases were a little bit smaller, and it was very hazardous work. Artillery shells were assembled at the Portland Company on the Portland waterfront. And this is one of the photographs of a group of women war workers doing this work in 1917 and 18 in Portland. No surprise that all up and down the Maine coast, because of our maritime heritage, vessels were built for the war effort, and they varied. The Portsmouth Naval Shipyard is our oldest naval shipyard in America, founded in 1800. It started making submarines in 1917, and of course is very vital to the maintenance of the submarine fleet to this day. Here is the first submarine being launched at the Naval Shipyard, and interestingly, it's coming out of the old Franklin Ship House, this massive structure built by during the Civil War to build ships for the Civil War, and that stood until the 1920s. And so it really bridged from one war to the World War effort to build submarines. A number of the shipyards, the civilian shipyards along the Maine coast, built big wooden transport ships for troops, for supplies, for ammunition, whatever. And these were basically one-way ships. They were assembled very rapidly, and the idea was to get whatever the cargo was across the Atlantic to the war effort, and then just abandon the vessel. And so here we have the Portland Ship Sealing Company requesting your honor at the launching of the Andra, the first ship constructed for the Emergency Fleet Corporation. This was on Eastern Promenade, April 1918. Here we see in the South Portland shipyard another one of these big, simple wooden transport ships being launched at the yard that would later become the great yard for building the steel Liberty ships, which essentially formed the same purpose in World War II, the Liberty ships, as were the wooden ships built for World War I. And Maine was very active up and down the coast in building these transport ships. Bath Iron Works, of course, had been building ships for the U.S. Navy since 1890, since the steel-hulled ships began to come in. And here is a 4-stack destroyer being launched at Bath during World War I for the Navy. The activity was so great in Bath during World War I with shipbuilding, both the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard doing Navy ships and also the building of these transport ships, that the Emergency Fleet Corporation actually built 2 entire neighborhoods for shipyard workers. This is a wooden neighborhood. There was also a neighborhood of brick houses. But the war was over before people thought it would be, and so people never actually lived in these shipbuilding families. The houses were sold off individually in the 1920s and are still there as neighborhoods today.
Wow.
Now, one of the fascinating maritime relating stories from World War I is the story of the Crown Prince Cecily, which was a German luxury liner. She sailed from New York in the summer of 1914, headed for Germany. And while she was crossing the Atlantic, the war broke out, and her German owners telegraphed her and said that you must turn back to the United States because otherwise you'll be passing through British waters and you'll probably be commandeered. Well, there were a number of people from the Bar Harbor summer community on board the Cecily, and they convinced the German captain that the closest port in America would be Bar Harbor. And so one morning in August, this huge liner appeared unannounced, in the harbor of Bar Harbor. You can see from scale the little local steamer that's coming out to get people. And so the ship was evacuated, and people went by other vessels or by train down to New York to reassemble to wherever they were going. And then, to the surprise of the Germans, the United States government commandeered the ship anyway. And part of the interest in this ship was the fact that in her hold, in her safe, was $10 million in German gold and $1 million in German silver. So she was kept in quarantine until the war broke out, and then she was confiscated and turned into a troop ship. And the United States Treasury got the money. Now, the war effort reached out to all sectors, and the U.S. Navy early on put out the call for all levels, all sizes of vessels that could be used in various ways by the Navy. Cyrus H.K. Curtis was a native of Portland. He was the very well-known publisher of the Saturday Evening Post and the Ladies' Home Journal and other important publications and newspapers. And from 1903 on until his death in 1933, he loved to come back to his native Maine. He had a beautiful summer home at Rockport. Beginning in 1907, he took his private yacht up the coast in the spring and went back in the fall in the yacht. And this is the yacht, the Lindonia. But when the war broke out and the Navy asked for vessels of all kinds, Cyrus Curtis contributed the Lindonia to the war cause. And when the war was over and there was an opportunity to get the Lindonia back, he said, no, he said, I think I'll build a bigger and better Lindonia, which he did. One of the major features of the war effort in Maine was the fortification of the coast of Maine, bearing in mind that, in particular, Portland Harbor and the mouth of the Penobscot leading up to Bangor were considered very strategic from an economic standpoint. And so Portland actually had several manned forts during World War I. These are troops of the Coastal Artillery Corps who are marching at Fort Williams. Fort Williams had been established at the time of the Spanish-American War, but it was major fort for Portland Harbor in both World War I and World War II. There was also an installation on Cushing Island, Fort Leavitt, and there was an active installation at Great Diamond, Fort McKinley. The Coastal Artillery Corps manned massive artillery guns. They were known as disappearing guns. They were built into these heavy concrete gun emplacements. They were, as you can see, in a down position in this view, so that if a German destroyer had ever attempted to come into Portland Harbor, initially they wouldn't realize that it was that well fortified, but then if they got too close, this is what would happen. The disappearing gun would appear and you would get a great blast. And this is what these gun emplacements at Williams in Cape Elizabeth, Leavitt, and McKinley were all about. Now, we'll switch for just a few minutes as we begin to come to a close to some of the men and women from Maine who participated in the war effort. All through our American history, immigrants have played an important part in the military, in fighting our wars. And this is a photo postcard taken of two young men from Lewiston who were of Greek descent who enlisted in the war effort. In 1918 and 19, when the war ended, there were massive parades of celebration. This is a photograph of the bridge between Lewiston and Auburn with a great victory parade in 1919. If you look carefully at the lower right, you'll see the first automobile crossing the bridge, and you'll see a man in a dark coat and a tall silk hat. That is Governor Carl Milliken. He was everywhere for these parades, whether they were during the war or after the war. Here is the great victory parade or welcome home parade in Bangor, coming down Central Street where we saw the Red Cross ladies a year before. And interestingly, the issues never change. Help get them a job is the banner in the front, meaning that men who are coming back from the war needed employment. Here we finally see Governor Milliken, although he has his back to us. This is the return of the battle flags from the Maine National Guard units. And we see Colonel Edwards at the right, at the very far right, and then Governor Milliken is in the long tail coat. He's not wearing his tall silk hat that day, and the flags are being presented to him. And if you go to the Hall of Flags in the State House today on the main floor, those World War I flags are still there a century later. Everywhere people celebrated the end of the war and honored those who participated in it. This is a group of young, mostly Army, but some Navy men who are members of the St. Augustine Roman Catholic Parish in Augusta. And in the spring of 1919, there was a special celebratory mass for those men who returned from the war, and at the same time, a plaque with their names was dedicated in front of the church. Everywhere there was a recognition of those who had served. During and after the war, wooden honor rolls were constructed in towns as small as Harrison with lists of the men from the area who were serving. And if there was a gold star there, and there are a couple gold stars, it means that they had lost their lives in France. Here is the honor roll for Lewiston, with literally hundreds of names, located in what is now Kennedy Park. These wooden honor rolls, for the most part, did not survive, although the same technique was used for World War II as well, to make people aware of those serving. And so many of these monuments were then replaced by bronze and by granite monuments. The official monument for World War I for the state of Maine is located in Kittery, and it is in two parts. In 1923, the state of New Hampshire and the state of Maine got together and built this bridge, which is, there's now a replica bridge of this that spans the Piscataqua River between Portsmouth and Kittery. In the old days, this was the automobile entrance to Maine, the beginning of Route 1. And on both ends of the bridge, beautiful bronze plaques and bronze eagles were placed. When the bridge was rebuilt a few years ago, the people designing the bridge said, oh, well, we'll take these plaques off and we'll put them in a park somewhere. And there was a great outcry, and people said, no, you must keep the plaques on the bridge. And indeed, they went back on the bridge. Then at the end of the bridge, the main end of the bridge, is a small park, John Paul Jones Park. And in that park is Maine's official monument. Now, there are many World War I monuments around the state that communities erected. This is the official one. And it's probably almost unlike any other World War I monument, not only in Maine, but in the country. For the governor at the time was Governor Percival P. Baxter. And Baxter was, of course, very supportive of the war effort, but at the same time, he also wanted people to remember the horrors of war. As Goyer said, the disasters of war. And so he found a young Eastern European sculptress in Boston to create this remarkable large bronze relief. And here we have a mother on the edge of the battlefield, cradling her child, trying to protect it. Two writhing bodies at her feet. And subtly over at the right, a whole line of soldiers marching into the front. And this was really very controversial because most people wanted to have a kind of patriotic, celebratory monument. But Baxter said, no, we need to remember the other side of war. And here's the name of the young woman sculptress, Baskev Payev. She was then in Boston, but I believe she was from Czechoslovakia or Poland. And it's a remarkable piece. But of course we have to remember Baxter was a wonderfully independent person. When the state of Maine, both during his legislative period and as governor, would not buy Mount Katahdin, he went out and bought it and gave it to the state, along with 200,000 acres. And when he was governor in 1923, his beloved Irish setter Gary died, and he lowered the State House flag to half-mast, much to the consternation of veterans groups and members of the public. And Baxter's simple response was that my dog has been more loyal to me than many men I have known. So I mentioned these other monuments around the state, and they're many and varied. One of the most beautiful ones is in the little town, the central Maine town of Palmyra. And here we have this lovely bronze relief, Civil War soldier at the right, World War I soldier in the center, and Revolutionary War soldier at the left. To my mind, it's one of the finest memorial sculptures in the state. Here is the War Memorial in Memorial Park in Augusta. In the background is a Civil War monument, and the soldier has his back to us, but he is bowing his head, saying a prayer at the grave of one of his comrades. That's the meaning of the sculpture. A much more sort of grand, victorious kind of monument was built just before World War II, but to World War I in downtown Bangor, a kind of victory figure holding a torch and a palm leaf. An old Civil War veteran gave the money in 1924 to build a victory arch in memory of those from the Farmington area. And if your town couldn't afford to build a specially designed monument, you could apply to the War Department for a captured German field piece to put on in your park. And here in the background in Holton is a Civil War monument, but apparently by the time of World War I, they couldn't quite scratch enough together in Holton to do their own monument, so they had a field artillery piece shipped to them. This is a...
Oh, that's Lincoln. Oh.
Yeah, that is Lincoln, right. Yes, yes. This is known as the American Doughboy. And most of the monuments were individually created, but this is one where you could actually order this from the sculptor. And this was created en masse and appears in many communities throughout the country. In fact, there's a website for this sculpture, and it shows all the places that it is in the United States. The only place it appears in Maine is up in northern Maine, in Lincoln, Maine.
Main Street.
And finally, some communities, they remembered in a very modest but meaningful way. This is the memorial tablet in the little town of Swansville, being dedicated in 1919 to the one man from Swansville who lost his life, Clarence Curtis, and his friends and compatriots have all come to the memorial dedication in their uniforms. So, World War I lasted only 19 months for America and for Maine, but it was a cataclysmic event which mobilized our people and our treasure and our effort in many different ways. And sadly, it prepared us for the next war that came just a little more than 20 years later, World War II. Many of the ideas, many of the techniques, many of the ways that we fought World War I then became our way ultimately to victory in World War II. These are young men who are just about to go off to World War I on the steps of the old post office in Lewiston. Thank you.
Oh.
That's it.